The golden loom shattered into ash before her very eyes, and in that single, breathless moment, Adora knew she had lost everything. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to where it all began, back to the dry season, back to the hunger, back to the woman who was given the rarest gift in the land, and threw it all away with her own 2 hands. Adora was poor. Not the kind of poor that people romanticize in songs, not simple living, happy heart poor. She was the kind of poor that woke her up at night with a hollow, gnawing ache in her stomach. The kind of poor where she would stare at her loom for hours, not because she lacked the skill to weave, but because she lacked the bark and thread to weave with. She was a young widow with no children, no family close enough to call, and neighbors who had long since stopped checking on her because her suffering made them uncomfortable. That dry season was the worst the village of Utoro had ever seen. The sun cracked the earth open like a wound. The river ran thin. Farmers lost their crops. And Adora, who survived by weaving and selling cloth at the market, had nothing left to work with. One evening, after a day of begging for scraps of material and being turned away at every door, she sat on the floor of her small hut and pressed her palms flat against the earth. She was not dramatic about it. She did not wail or tear her clothing. She simply sat there, very quietly, and felt the full, crushing weight of a life that seemed to be caving in on her from all sides. At that moment, she made a decision to go into the sacred forest. Now, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and please do us a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell here will keep you coming back. If you are already family, you already know, things are about to get very interesting. Now, let's continue. The elders of Utoro had warned for generations that no one must enter the sacred forest after sundown. It was not because of animals, nor because of thieves, but because the forest was alive in ways that daylight could not contain. Strange things happened in those trees after dark. People who went in did not always come back the same, while some did not even come back at all. Adora knew all of this, but she went anyway. She told herself she was only going to gather bark from the outer trees, just enough to give her loom something to work with. Just enough to make one cloth, sell it, and buy food for the week. That was all she needed. 1 week. 1 chance. But the outer trees had been stripped bare by others who had come before her with the same desperate logic. And so, without fully deciding to, she found herself walking deeper and deeper, until the sounds of the village disappeared entirely, and the only things she could hear were the breathing of the forest and the soft crush of dry leaves beneath her feet. She walked until her legs gave out. She then sat down at the base of a great, ancient tree, pulled her knees to her chest, and did something she had not allowed herself to do in months. She cried. She cried the way a person cries when there is no one watching, with her whole body shaking and heaving, all the grief she had been swallowing for so long finally pouring out of her at once. She cried for her dead husband. She cried for the children she never had. She cried for every door that had been shut in her face. She cried because she was tired, bone tired, and she did not know how much longer she could keep going. What is it that you want? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not loud, but it filled the entire forest like water fills a cup. Adora scrambled to her feet so fast she nearly fell. She pressed her back against the tree and looked wildly around her. The forest had gone very still. Even the wind had stopped. And then she saw it. A figure stood between the trees, tall and ancient-looking, draped in something that moved like leaves but shimmered like water. Its eyes were the color of deep river water, not frightening, but bottomless, The kind of eyes that made you feel seen all the way down to the parts of yourself you had never shown anyone. I asked you a question, the figure said, calm as still water. What is it that you want? Adora's mouth was dry. Her heart was hammering. Every sensible thought in her head was screaming at her to run. But somehow, in the deepest part of her, she understood that running would be pointless. She started, then stopped. Then started again. I want to stop being poor. Her voice cracked on the last word. I want to eat without wondering if it will be my last meal. I want to wake up without fear. She stopped herself, swallowed hard and continued. I want to be wealthy. I want a life that does not feel like punishment. The figure looked at her for a long moment. Then it moved, not walking exactly, more like the forest rearranged itself to bring it closer, until it stood only a few feet away from her. I am EJ, it said. I am older than this forest. I have watched your village from the time your grandmother's grandmothers were children. And I have watched you, Adora. I know what kind of woman you are. Adora did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. I will give you what you are asking for, EJ said. But there are conditions. 2 of them. You must listen carefully, and you must remember every word. Yes, Adora whispered. I will give you a golden loom. With it, you will weave cloth more beautiful than anything this village has ever seen. People will come from far and near to buy from you. You will become wealthy beyond what you can currently imagine. EJ paused. But you must never, not once, weave a single cloth for yourself. Every cloth that loom produces must go to another person. The moment you weave for your own use, the loom will know. And you will face the consequences. Adora nodded slowly. That did not seem so hard. She had never been weaving for herself to begin with. The second condition, EJ continued, and its voice dropped slightly lower, is this. After 6 months, you must return the loom to this forest. Exactly 6 months. Not a day more. Adora felt a cold movement through her chest at that. 6 months, she repeated. 6 months, EJ said, without blinking. After that, it comes back to me. Do you understand and accept both conditions? Adora thought about her empty hut, her bare loom, the gnawing in her stomach. Yes, she said quickly. I accept. If you need to think about it more carefully, you can leave now and come back tomorrow at this same time, EJ suggested. Adora shook her head. No. Please, I don't need to think about it. I accept the conditions. EJ sighed slightly, reached into the folds of its shimmering flowery garment, and produced a loom no larger than a child's toy. But the moment it was placed in Adora's hands, it grew, warm and golden and humming faintly, like something that was alive. Go, EJ said. And remember what you promised. Adora walked out of that forest a different woman. Not because she had changed it, at least, not yet, but because for the first time in years, she had something she had almost forgotten the feeling of. Hope. She clutched the golden loom to her chest the entire walk home, half convinced that if she loosened her grip even slightly, it would dissolve like a dream, and she would be left standing in the dark with nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat. She set it up in her hut that very night. The moment her hands touched the frame and she began to thread it, she understood that EJ had not been exaggerating. The loom moved almost by itself, fluid and responsive, like it was reading her intentions before her fingers could execute them. The cloth that emerged was unlike anything she had ever produced. The colors were deep and luminous, shifting slightly depending on how the light hit them. The patterns seemed to breathe. She ran her fingers across the finished edge and felt her throat tighten. She had never made anything this beautiful in her life. By the time the sun rose the next morning, She had 12 complete pieces of cloth laid out on her floor. She wrapped them carefully, carried them to the market, and set them out on her table. She did not even finish arranging them before the crowd gathered. Women pressed forward, reaching out to touch the fabric with wide eyes. Men called their wives over. A trader from 3 villages away held one piece up to the light and turned it slowly, shaking his head in disbelief. Within an hour, all 12 pieces were sold. The money Adora counted in her palm that afternoon was more than she had made in the previous 3 months combined. She went home and jumped for joy. The weeks that followed moved like a river that had finally found its course, fast, purposeful, and full. Word spread about Adora's cloth the way word always spreads in a small village, fast and with embellishment. People said the fabric never faded. They said wearing it made you feel lighter, more confident, and more alive. They said she must have made a deal with something beyond this world, and on that last point, they were not entirely wrong. She hired 2 young women to help her carry and sell. She repaired her hut. She bought food, the kind with variety and abundance. She slept through the night for the first time in years. She bought new sandals and new shoes. She bought fabric for curtains. Small things, ordinary things, but to Adora, each one felt like a quiet miracle. By the 2nd month, she was the most talked about woman in Utoro. By the 3rd month, she was the wealthiest commoner in the village, and the king had sent a personal messenger requesting 6 pieces of her finest cloth for the royal household. She stood in her hut the evening after that messenger left, looked around at everything she had built in just 12 weeks, and felt an unfamiliar feeling settle in her chest. She felt powerful, and that feeling, warm and intoxicating as palm wine, was the beginning of the end. It was a small thought at first. So small she almost didn't notice it. She was weaving one afternoon, a particularly exquisite piece, deep indigo with threads of gold running through it like veins, and she held the finished cloth up and thought, almost casually, I have never worn anything this beautiful in my entire life. She folded it, packed it, and sold it. But the thought came back. It came back the next day when she wove a rich burgundy cloth and watched a merchant's wife wrap it around herself and practically glow. It came back the week after when she delivered the king's order to the palace and saw how the royal women moved through the courtyard draped in her work, radiant, elevated, admired. It came back every single time she placed something extraordinary into someone else's hands and walked away with only money. I made this, she would think. Why can I not have even one? She pushed the thought down. She remembered Ejei's words, and she kept weaving. But somewhere around the 5th month, the thought stopped being small. It grew teeth. It started whispering to her at night. You have been obedient. You have given everyone else the best of what you make. You deserve something too. Just one cloth. Just one. Who would even know? And then there was the matter of the loom itself. As the 6th month crept closer, Adora began to look at it differently. The warm, grateful feeling she'd had the night Ejei placed it in her hands had gradually been replaced by something more possessive. Mine, she thought when she looked at it now. This is mine. She had built her entire life around it. Her reputation. Her income. Her identity. She was no longer poor Adora the widow. She was now Adora the weaver, the woman whose cloth the king himself wore. How was she supposed to give that back? How was she supposed to go back to being without the loom? The 6th month arrived. The 1st week of it passed. Then the 2nd. Adora did not go to the forest. She told herself she would go the next week. Then she told herself the forest had not given her a specific date, only a month, and surely there was some flexibility in that. Then she stopped telling herself anything at all and simply continued weaving, continued selling, continued stacking her money in the clay pot beneath her sleeping mat. It was during the 3rd week of the 6th month that she made her real mistake. The king had announced a grand festival, 3 days of celebration for a successful harvest season. The entire village was invited to the palace grounds, and everyone was expected to come dressed in their finest. Adora began to have different thoughts as she paced through her room. My customers would be at the festival. The king would be there. Every person who had ever bought from me would be wearing my work, moving through that festival like living advertisements for my craft. And I would arrive in what? A plain wrapper from the market made by someone else when I'm a maker of extraordinary ones myself. She sat in front of the golden loom the night before the festival and stared at it for a long time. Then she reached for the thread. She worked through the night, and what she created was the most magnificent thing she had ever made. A wrapper of deep forest green with intricate patterns woven in copper and gold, the edges detailed with symbols she had never consciously designed, but which seemed to appear beneath her fingers of their own accord. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of cloth that stopped people mid-sentence. She held it up in the early morning light and felt her heart swell with pride so fierce it almost hurt. She told herself it was just this once, and that she had earned it. She also told herself that EJ would never know. She wrapped it around herself, pinned it carefully at her shoulder, and walked out of her hut into the golden morning, the most beautifully dressed woman in all of Utoro, heading straight toward the worst moment of her life. The festival was everything Utoro had ever dreamed of. The palace grounds were alive with drumming so deep it rattled the chest, with the smell of roasted meat and fresh palm wine, with the laughter of children weaving between the legs of adults who were too busy admiring each other's clothing to pay them any attention. Colored canopies had been stretched between wooden poles. Musicians sat in circles, competing with each other in the most joyful way. The king sat on his throne beneath a grand canopy, flanked by his chiefs, watching his people celebrate with the satisfied expression of a man who believed all was right with his world. And then Adora walked in. The crowd parted almost instinctively. Not because anyone asked them to, but because she was simply that arresting. The green and gold wrapper caught the morning light and threw it back in ways that made people blink and look again. Women stopped mid-conversation. Men turned their heads. Even the drummers lost their rhythm for just a moment. Adora felt all of it. Every single gaze. And she stood taller inside it, letting it wash over her like warm water. This, she thought, was what she had been working for. This was what she deserved. She had barely made it 20 steps into the grounds when she heard the first gasp. She assumed it was admiration.
Look,
she smiled
it's dripping
and kept
everywhere.
walking.
What is this?
Then she heard another. And another. And then a child's voice, brutally honest the way only children's voices can be, cutting clean through the noise of the festival. Mama, why is that woman's cloth turning into rags? Adora froze. She looked down. The edges of her wrapper were dissolving. Not all at once, but steadily, thread by thread, the magnificent forest green unraveling from the hem upward like smoke being pulled apart by wind. The copper and gold patterns she had woven through the night were fading, bleaching out of the fabric in real time, leaving behind nothing but coarse, gray, lifeless thread that crumbled the moment it lost its color. She grabbed at the cloth with both hands, and it disintegrated at her touch. No, she whispered. No way. This can't be happening. But the loom had already decided. By the time she could fully process what was happening, she was standing in the middle of the king's festival, surrounded by hundreds of her neighbors, wrapped in what could only be described as rags. Gray, formless, falling apart rags. The kind of cloth you would not use to clean a floor. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. And then the murmuring started. Is that not Adora the Weaver? What happened to her cloth? I have never seen anything like that in my life. She could not move. She could not speak. Her face was burning so hot, she was certain people could see it from across the grounds. Every eye in that festival was on her. The kings, the chiefs, her customers, her neighbors, strangers who had come from other villages and did not even know her name, but were watching with wide, fascinated eyes regardless. The king leaned forward on his throne. Is that truly the weaver? He asked his chief, loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Adora did not wait for the answer. She turned and she ran. She ran through the crowd, through the palace gates, through the village paths, all the way back to her hut, and what greeted her there broke what was left of her completely. The golden loom was ash. It wasn't broken. It was not damaged. But it had become ash, a neat, gray pile of it sitting exactly where the loom had stood, as though the forest spirit had simply breathed on it and unmade it entirely. She dropped to her knees in front of it and pressed her hands into the ash and felt nothing but cold. She was still kneeling there when the first knock came at her door. It was one of her customers, a woman named Destiny, who had bought 3 pieces of cloth from her just 2 weeks prior. Adora opened the door and knew immediately from Destiny's face that the news was not good. Adora. Destiny's voice was careful and controlled, the way voices get when someone is trying very hard not to scream. My clothes. All 3 pieces. I want to put them on this morning and they fell apart in my hands. Just threads. Nothing. Before Adora could respond, there was another knock. Then another. They came one after the other, her customers, some confused, some hurt, some furious, all carrying the same story. Clothes that had been pristine the night before had turned to rags by morning. Wrappers that women had been saving for special occasions had disintegrated when they unfolded them. The pieces she had delivered to the palace, the king's order, gone, every last one of them. And the money. The money she had stacked so carefully in the clay pot beneath her sleeping mat, she hurriedly went to check. Stones. The money had become gray, ordinary, useless stones. Every coin she had ever earned from that loom, replaced with stones, as though the wealth had never existed at all. By the time the last customer left her door, Adora was sitting on the floor of her hut with nothing. Literally nothing. The loom was ash. The money was stones. Her reputation was ruined. And outside her door, the whole of Utoro was buzzing with a story that would follow her name for the rest of her life. She sat there until nightfall. And then she got up, wrapped herself in her old plain cloth, and ran back into the forest. She did not bring anything with her. There was nothing to bring. She found the spot at the base of the great ancient tree without even trying, as though the forest itself guided her feet. And EJ was already there, standing in the shadows between the trees, still and watchful, those deep river water eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. Adora opened her mouth to beg. The words were ready. She had been rehearsing them the entire journey, a full speech about desperation and weakness, and how she had not truly understood what she was throwing away until it was gone. But the moment she looked into EJ's eyes, every rehearsed word dissolved. She closed her mouth. Then she opened it again and said the only true thing left inside her. I am so sorry. EJ looked at her for a long time without speaking. The forest breathed around them. Somewhere far above, leaves shifted. You were told, EJ said finally. The voice was not cruel. It was simply certain. The way a river is certain, it does not argue with the rocks. It simply moves around them and keeps going. 2 conditions. But you refused both. I know, Adora whispered. You were given 6 months of a life most people in your village will never taste. You were trusted with something sacred. And when the time came to honor that trust, you chose greed. Adora said nothing. There was nothing to say. Every word EJ spoke landed clean and true, and she had no argument against any of it. I cannot restore what you destroyed, EJ said. That is not how this works. The loom is gone. The wealth is gone. What you did with the time and the gift, that is yours to carry. Adora felt the tears coming, but she did not try to stop them this time. Will I ever, she started. That, EJ said quietly, depends entirely on you. Not on me. Not on the loom. On you. The spirit's gaze held hers for one final moment. Go home, Adora. And this time learn. Then the forest went still, and EJ was gone, disappeared into the trees, and Adora was alone between the trees with nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the long, hard road back to a village that now knew exactly who she was. She walked home slowly. She did not run this time. And perhaps that the willingness to walk steadily back into consequences she had created was the very first step toward becoming someone worthy of a second chance. But that is a story for another day. And that, dear viewers, is where we leave Adora today. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the gifts you have been given and the conditions attached to them, drop a comment below and tell us. We read every single one. If you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and leave us a like if this story kept you until the very end. We pour everything into these folktales, and your support is what keeps this forest alive. We will see you in the next story.